Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. When Abraham Lincoln became president in March 1861, many Americans clung to the hope that war might somehow be avoided. The Confederate attack upon Fort Sumter and Lincoln's subsequent call for 75,000 troops quickly forced people to choose sides. 4 of the states in the Upper South that had remained in the Union until then now voted to secede. The convention in Missouri, as we learned in our last video, rejected that option. Dramatic events in St. Louis polarized the state. Like Fort Sumter, the riot that followed Nathaniel Lyon's capture of Camp Jackson forced Missourians to get off the fence. The civilian casualties sparked outrage across the state, and Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson seized upon this anger and fear as he worked to maneuver Missouri out of the Union. The moderate suggestion that armed neutrality remained a viable path briefly found support in a May agreement brokered by Sterling Price and William Harney. That tentative peace, however, collapsed in just a few weeks, and a fateful meeting between Lyon and Jackson in St. Louis's Planter House finally brought Missouri to the brink of civil war. After his bold capture of Camp Jackson, Lyon hoped that his forced march of prisoners back to the federal arsenal would show the stakes and the cost of disloyalty for Missourians. The propaganda value of this move, though, vanished when the riots in the streets of St. Louis erupted. Instead, the incident increased hostility toward the federal government. It strengthened the political standing of the secessionist governor, and it accelerated the pace of events in the state. In his first months in office, Claiborne Jackson struggled to win support among many moderates. On the evening of May 10th, though, the governor entered the Hall of Representatives with news of the Camp Jackson affair. Opposition to his previous militia bill melted. Both houses of the General Assembly passed the militia bill within 15 minutes. Among the steps taken by alarmed state legislators, they provided for the enrollment of every able-bodied man to defend the state. They raised $2 million for the defense of Missouri, granting that all funds reserved for schools and charitable institutions now go toward the state militia. To replace the old county-based state militia and volunteer companies, they created a new organization, the Missouri State Guard. The legislature gave to Governor Jackson extraordinary powers over these troops. The man who came to lead the Missouri State Guard was Major General Sterling Price, whose political and military service made him among the best-known men in the state. Price had been named Speaker of the Missouri House and then was elected to Congress. He later resigned to that seat to fight in the Mexican War. In 1852, he had been elected governor of Missouri. He was a strong Unionist, sometimes clashing with Claiborne Jackson. And in the spring of 1861, delegates had selected Price to be president of the statewide secession convention. Like the majority of those delegates, Price voted against secession. But he did support a failed resolution that stated federal coercion would lead Missouri to stand with its fellow slave states. He joined the growing number of Missourians whose previous neutrality now shifted toward pro-Southern loyalties. The task that Price faced as head of the Missouri State Guard was considerable. He was charged with suppressing insurrection within a state and then repelling invasion from without. And this was a real challenge. The borders that Missouri shared with the neighboring free states of Illinois and Iowa and Kansas, they were almost 900 miles long. General William Harney returned to St. Louis in mid-May. En route to Washington, he had been captured by Confederates at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was taken to Richmond, but he refused to support the Southern cause and was released. Back in Missouri, Harney expressed support for the capture of Camp Jackson, although not the violence that it sparked, and he criticized Governor Jackson's new militia bill. The general had assured Washington that he could hold Missouri within the Union through his firm but conciliatory leadership, keeping order in St. Louis, but somehow avoiding a declaration of martial law. Frank Blair, meanwhile, urged the Lincoln administration to replace the cautious Harney with his bolder, younger subordinate, Nathaniel Lyon. On May 20th, Blair got his wish, receiving an envelope that ordered Harney's removal and Lyon's promotion to brigadier general. Lincoln also allowed Blair to deliver this order whenever he saw fit. But in the meantime, Blair kept it to himself. The very next morning, William Harney met with Sterling Price to forge an arrangement to keep the peace in Missouri. According to the arrangement they struck, Price would be responsible for maintaining peace in outstate Missouri, in the rural areas, while Harney would preserve order in St. Louis. As long as Price held to his end of the deal, Harney agreed not to move his troops beyond the St. Louis area. Price then returned to Jefferson City and ordered the dispersal of Missouri State Guard troops to their home districts. In short, under the Price-Harney agreement, the federal government would respect the neutrality of the state government. The deal frustrated extremists on both sides. Some secessionist volunteers spoiled for a fight. Unionists in St. Louis believed that the governor and would-be Confederates should be dealt with forcefully. James Broadhead of the Union Safety Committee in St. Louis wrote, "We fear that no good will come of the arrangement, but that it will only result in putting off the evil day until such time as the enemy will be better prepared to make resistance." Such fears were not misplaced. Claiborne Jackson quietly pressed Confederate leaders for greater support. In St. Louis, rumors swirled. Unionists across the state reportedly faced harassment from their pro-Confederate neighbors. On May 30th, Blair finally delivered Lincoln's order to remove Harney from command. Lyon thus succeeded him, rising to the rank of brigadier general. The move alarmed Jackson and Price, who publicly urged calm, but secretly they encouraged district commanders in the Missouri State Guard to ready their men for action. As hopes for peace waned, pro-slavery moderates arranged for a conference between state and federal leaders on the morning of June 11th. This meeting took place at the Planter's House in St. Louis, and it brought together Jackson, Price, Lyon, and Blair. Governor Jackson insisted upon Missouri's neutrality and suggested that in exchange for disbanding the state militia, the Unionist and mostly German St. Louis Home Guards be disbanded too. Lyon, however, refused to budge and insisted upon the Army's right to raise such Home Guards throughout the state and to station them there to protect against Confederate invasion. The meeting in the governor's suite dragged into its 5th hour without progress. When it became clear that agreement was impossible, Lyon bluntly declared, "Rather than concede to the state of Missouri for one single instant the right to dictate to my government in any matter however unimportant, I would see you and you and you and every man, woman, and child in the state dead and buried." Then, rising to his feet, he added, "This means war. In 1 hour, one of my officers will call for you and conduct you out of my lines." Rather than wait for a reply, Lyon stormed out of the room. Jackson, Price, and their secretary, Thomas Snead, they did not wait for the promised federal escort. They immediately fled the building, and they fled St. Louis. They went to the railroad yards and commandeered an engine and sped westward toward the state capitol. They stopped briefly 3 times, once to fuel the engine and twice to burn the bridges and to cut the telegraph lines over the Gasconade and Osage rivers. The party arrived in Jefferson City in the very early hours of the next day. Snead rushed from the train to arrange for the distribution of the proclamation that Jackson had just drafted en route. In it, the governor described the failed meeting with Lyon, and he called for an additional 50,000 volunteers in the Missouri State Guard. By dawn, the governor's dispatch spread across the state, and the Guard's commanders began to ready their men for service in the field. In short, the federal commander, charged with keeping Missouri in the Union, declared war upon the state government whom he believed was conspiring with the Confederacy. The neutrality that had endured in Missouri, however briefly and barely, it seemed at an end. For next week, we consider the summer of 1861, when the eyes of the nation were on Missouri yet again, and the Unionist and pro-Confederate forces who struggled for control of the state. Until then.